Get started. I'm Derwin DeBose. I'm a Sheila C. Johnson Fellow here at the Center for Public Leadership. We want to welcome you to CPL and to the Hauser Institute's Frontline with Faculty. It's a venue for Harvard faculty affiliated with both the center and the institute to share their work and research with their faculty colleagues and students in an informal setting. We want to have spirited debate here and a lot of discussion about the topics we'll discuss. I have the honor of presenting Dean Williams, adjunct lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School. It's an honor not just because I'm in his class right now, but it's an honor because people call me the chief evangelist for his courses. So I call my mom every Monday and Wednesday to kind of debrief and talk about the adaptive leadership challenges she's facing in education. And I was on a date last night, actually, and the person said, can we not talk about adaptive leadership challenges and just hang out tonight? So, you'll learn why he's an exciting person to hear from. When I look at his resume, it's just impressive. So he was the chief advisor to the president of Madagascar. He's worked for governments in Queensland, Australia, the government of Brunei, the Singapore government's National Productivity Board. He's worked with the government of East Timor, the government of Nigeria. He's worked with companies in Australia, the US, Asia, Japan, and Madagascar. But what's most impressive about Professor Williams' work is that he holds up a mirror to us individually to look at our own leadership, but also at culture, systems, and groups to really look hard at the issues facing us. And as we know, sometimes we don't like what we see in the mirror. So he does a good job of probing and pushing that. Tonight we have the opportunity to hear from him regarding his newest book, Leadership for a Fractured World: How to Cross Boundaries, Build Bridges, and Lead Change. And we have something fun. So if you would look under your seat, and if you have a Post-it note under your seat, you'll get an opportunity to go home with a copy of his book tonight. So it is an excellent book that I've had the pleasure to read and learn from over the semester, and very much looking forward to hearing Professor Williams' take on leadership and ways we can push ourselves to face and solve the adaptive challenges facing us. So without further ado, Dean Williams.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out. I just want to begin, in case some of you have come here to hear the wrong person. I'm not a real dean. I'm a dean in name only, not in position. And a few years ago I had a student halfway through the class kind of raise his hand and said just that. He said, "You're not a real dean." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I came to this school and I came to this class thinking I'm going to learn from the dean of the Kennedy School." And at that time it was Joe Nye, so he wanted to learn from the master on international relations and soft power. But that same student, I'll never forget, he also added that I think I know more about leadership than you do and probably most people in this class. I said, "Yeah, why is that?" And he said, "Well, because I've been a prime minister of a country." And I said, "Well, very impressive. And how long were you prime minister?" And he said, "Well, for 6 months." I said, 6 months, okay, so what happened?" He said, "Well, one day I went out into the countryside, and the next day I came back, and somebody else was doing my job." And so he was clearly overthrown, apparently by his own party. And it was a turning point in the class because he realized, well, actually, there's a lot that I don't know about this leadership thing. And by virtue of holding this position of responsibility and authority, I had notions about leadership that were incomplete. I started to take the course seriously and started to learn a lot more about the complexity of this challenge and a realization no matter how talented we are, perhaps in politics, none of us really have leadership figured out. He returned, graduated from the Kennedy School, returned to his country. Rather than have another shot at being prime minister, he went for the big alpha job to be the president of the country and got elected, and today he's the president and doing extraordinary things in his country and trying to apply these leadership principles. I've been working with Ronnie Heifetz for 30 years and teaching here for 15 years. And so really been wrestling with this question of leadership and leadership for a fractured world. And I suggest that it's not that the world is fractured. I know that a lot of things work in the world, but there are many fractures that impede problem solving. And a way to think about fractures is on a continuum. At one end is the extreme fractures that we would see, this gap between ISIS and the rest of the world, for example. Perhaps halfway down that continuum, you would see the fractures in political parties and between political parties in the context of the United States, between the Republicans and the Democrats. And it's not a divided political system, but the fractures make it very difficult to formulate, agree on, implement public policy. And at the low end of that continuum would be what I call hairline fractures. These fractures or divisions that they're real, but they are latent. They are there, but people kind of get on with their job. But due to a sudden event, some kind of perturbance in the system, an interruption, something happens, like as what we have seen in North Charleston, South Carolina, or in Ferguson, Missouri, it activates the fault line, and then the fracture becomes wider and reveals the nature and perhaps the extent of the adaptive challenge that's never really been handled or brought to resolution in that community. So these fractures are both divisions, but they're also opportunities. They reveal the complexity of the problem and highlight the fact that all is not well and that leadership is needed. But there's not sufficient leadership to address these challenges, because as I look at it, people relate to leadership in ways that they do not fully understand and appreciate what leadership is, and that's what we here at the Kennedy School in teaching adaptive leadership try to change the paradigm, the way of thinking about leadership. And most people think about leadership in a very traditional way of what I call big man leadership. Big man leadership is really about authority, but just using kind of everyday language, big man leadership or big woman leadership is about a dominant authority figure that represents their tribe and their tribal interests. And the group looks to their tribal chief to advance their interests, to take care of them, to look after them. When I was in my 20s and a graduate student here, I had the opportunity for about 2 years to live in the jungles of Borneo on and off with this group of hunters and gatherers called the Punan tribe, and also spend time with another tribe called the Kalabit tribe and the Iban tribe. The Kalabit and the Iban were formerly headhunters, and had only stopped headhunting in recent years. Thank goodness. It was very kind of challenging to live with them, and you did not want to upset them too much, because the practice was more ceremonial than out of spite or anger, and what it meant to become a man was to take somebody's head and to prove your manhood. So it was ritualistic and ceremonial as a function of transitioning in status and position in communities. But I learned a lot about the tribal impulse by virtue of being in and living with and seeing how these tribes responded. There's beauty to the tribe. I don't want to romanticize it, but there is this sense of social capital and connection and relationship that's very powerful and wonderful to see. Ritual and ceremony are very critical to the well-being of the tribe, and these ritual and ceremonies have very ancient roots. And people may not fully understand the origins, but the tradition and the mythology kind of orient people to deal with the complexities of life in their environment. And they also have very thick boundaries to protect them and to protect their well-being and their interests. Literally their territory, but also their culture and their practices. So there's a tribal wisdom that allows them to survive in this harsh environment and to read the terrain. And so the outsider coming into that terrain doesn't understand that terrain and can quickly perish unless you have indigenous people to navigate the complexity of that terrain. So, yes, problem solving does take place, people are able to survive in that place. But they generally succeed because the problems become predictable, or they're reoccurring problems for which the wisdom of the ancients get passed to the next generation that allow them to survive. And what we teach here and what we write about in the context of adaptive challenges, these are challenges for which the traditional habitual tribal ways of operating are insufficient for dealing with as it pertains to the complexity of the world today. Now, I don't want to suggest that tribal wisdom cannot help us deal with the complexities of the challenges today. Jared Diamond, who wrote the book Collapse: How Societies Choose to Succeed or Fail, also recently wrote a book about tribal wisdom and what it's got to teach us today. So I know that wisdom is certainly there. But by virtue of being tribal, we like to stick to the habitual ways of operating, the predictable ways of operating, and maintaining our roles within that system and deferring to the big man leaders to show the way. I want to suggest that all of us are tribal by nature. E.O. Wilson, the great biologist here at Harvard, agrees with that notion that humans are fundamentally tribal. Also at Harvard we have what's called Cognitive Morality Lab, something like that. It's headed by Joshua Green, who wrote a book on tribes and the cultural, from a neurological point of view, saying that the human brain is it's a moral brain, but the underpinnings of that morality are born of its tribal roots. So the moral brain is really a tribal brain. And so our fundamental tribal orientation adds to the divisions and the fractures in the world. We find it extremely difficult to cross these divides and work with other groups, and therefore we reinforce our boundaries. Now, unlike the Punan tribe that I lived with, that did not really interact with many other tribes, today as human beings, we interact with a lot of different tribes. And we have some say in the kinds of membership in these diverse tribes that we want to belong to. There's online tribes, and with social media, where we connect with people of similar interests and carry on a conversation, often a global conversation. But we also have the tribes in our respective institutions. We've got the Harvard Kennedy School tribe, and within that tribe there's the Economist tribe, and we've got the Adaptive Leadership tribe over here, and the Public Policy tribe, and the Public Management tribe. And over in the Business School they've got their tribe, and literally our school and their school are divided by a river. And it's sometimes difficult to cross that river to promote the cross-fertilization of ideas, to expand the tribal boundary, so to speak, which is really the challenge that we face today, to expand these boundaries to generate more opportunity and more creativity. And in particular, what I'm suggesting, to exercise leadership today, you need to be a global change agent. And a global change agent deals with interdependent problems. Big man leadership, traditional ways of thinking about authority, operate within boundaries. They reinforce boundaries. When they cross boundaries, it's more to kind of get what they need to advance the interests of their group. The change agent is crossing boundaries to mobilize diverse groups to participate in the problem-solving process. And today we face interdependent problems, and they are not exclusively tribal problems unless you must help the tribe make adaptations to the larger environment. Of course, to do this work, you have to build what I'm suggesting 4 critical capacities: crossing boundaries, busting boundaries, transcending boundaries, and building bridges. Let me talk briefly about those. Crossing boundaries, the first one. Obviously, since the beginning of time, people have been crossing boundaries. The general manifestations of what we see pertaining to crossing boundaries are around that's not consistent with real leadership by any means. The imperialist has always crossed boundaries to impose their will on others or to exploit resources for their gain. The missionary crosses boundaries to convert the other, suggesting that they have the truth and others do not have that truth. The tourist crosses boundaries to have a superficial cultural experience without having any depth or substance, or certainly not engaging in problem solving, or seeing the reality of what's really going on behind the facade. Other forms of boundary crossing could be the crusader, who I have this objective, I'll cross these boundaries to get my objective, and if you get in the way, you do so at your own peril. And none of that is to advance the adaptive work that's critical in communities. So I'm using this term change agent leadership as really what we teach in our courses about leadership, but I'm calling it the global change agent because the book is dealing with leadership for a fractured world, suggesting you've got to be a global change agent and have a global mindset as you take on this work. You have to relate to the largest system as the playground in which you're going to operate. You have to be able to read these forces in this larger environment and these currents in this world that are global in nature, whether you're talking about demographic shifts in the larger world or environmental changes or economic financial challenges or cultural changes and technological inventions. They all have a global dimension, so you have to be able to read how those forces impact what's going on locally. So as a global change agent, you may not literally be that international diplomat crossing these boundaries to connect with diverse groups, but you're helping your own group at a local level deal with the complexity of these challenges in order to better respond to these forces. Now, if you're crossing boundaries with solutions and answers, and you're doing it like a bulldozer and forcing people to kind of comply, to wake up, to attend to the challenges, you'll be dismissed very fast. There's a term that got invented in the early 60s called the ugly American, based on a book that was written and then a film that was made starring Marlon Brando. And anybody can be called ugly. It could be the ugly American, the ugly Australian, the ugly Chinese, the ugly this, the ugly that. And ugliness is really a product of insensitivity, where you're crossing these boundaries, kind of waving the flag of your particular group, your narrative, and being insensitive to the impact that that's having on others. And therefore, you might have a wonderful, noble, honorable message, and you're there for, to address critical challenges. But by virtue of doing that, your ugliness overwhelms your capacity, or the capacity to be heard. And so in crossing boundaries, you've got to manage the ugliness and figure out how ugly am I willing to be, because you will be ugly to some degree if you're going to be exercising leadership, or at least some factions will consider you ugly. Why? Because you're calling attention to problems in the system that they would prefer to ignore or to justify or to just outright avoid or to neutralize you so that life can go on and persist as it's always done. A few years ago, we had this, just like you, a young Kennedy School graduate, and get this fantastic job to be the superintendent of education in the Washington, D.C. schools, Michelle Rhee. And Tim had an opportunity, right, of working in her school district with her. And she obviously was a person who had a big heart, Korean American, grew up here in the United States, well educated, experience working with poor African American children in different schools around the country, and then gets the top job to run a school system. So there's no doubt pertaining to her spirit of commitment and generosity and her passion to make a difference. And her mission was to ensure that these kids got the best education they possibly could in the country by the best teachers, in the best schools, in the best school district. Very high aspiration. But she was going into one of the poorest school districts in the country, and without any appreciation for the political realities and the cultural realities of this school district. And within the first year, she fired more than 200 people. 30 plus principals were also fired, and 720 people were put on notice that if you don't change your ways, you'll get the royal boot. She alienated the school district, the school committee, and she angered and alienated and created enemies out of the teachers' union and also the local city council. And so after 2 years, Michelle was fired from her job, even though what she was doing from a technical point of view looked darn good. What Michelle did, in our language, was treat a complex adaptive challenge in a technical way. And she failed to do the boundary work. And she said, well, listen, my job isn't a politician. I'm not in the business of politics. I'm in the business of education. Well, when you take on this work, there is this political dimension. You have to cross these boundaries. You have to connect with these people. And one of the people who came to her was an African-American fellow, the old mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry. A very complicated fellow. And he said to her, listen, you know, District 8, where the school system was, is my district. I know my way around, you know. This is my territory and space. You know, jump in the car, Michelle, and I'm going to drive you here and there, and I'll show you what it's like. She didn't want to get in the car with him. She said, thank you, I'll go in my car. But eventually, you know, she ended up going with him. But she tried to have some distance from him. But he potentially could have been this great cultural navigator, and others could have been, to help understand the nature of the terrain, the history of the terrain, in a predominantly poor African-American city where few African-American people could get jobs, certainly in business or anywhere else. And the opportunity to work in this system was rare. And certainly, yes, many people didn't have their eye on what's required to create these great schools, and many of them were inclined to become bureaucratic and a little bit cynical and skeptical about change. But she failed to bring them along. You could say she failed in her leadership work and was ultimately fired. It's complex, this work, and it's difficult work. But if you come in like a bulldozer, without appreciating what these cultural narratives are, what's their story, why do they think and feel the way they do, and then you can get a sense of what's the maladaptive work that needs to change, which leads to the next challenge that I call busting boundaries. It's perhaps a little bit of a bold term, but it's the realization that internally some boundaries need to be broken up in order to respond to these other challenges. So Michelle Rhee is right. The teaching boundaries needed to be busted. A teacher could not teach in isolation just in their own little classroom without interacting with other teachers. The boundaries of administrators needed to be busted up. They could not persist in being bureaucrats. The boundaries between the school and the community need to be busted so that those people would start interacting. And the boundaries in the political system in the school council need to be busted because they couldn't relate to this as purely as an exclusive political challenge, but need to understand it as a systemic challenge for a community. So she's right from that point of view, but she tried to bust too many boundaries at a time without really pacing that work strategically to bring people along. And in busting those boundaries, she made the work too much about her. I think it was Time magazine or Newsweek. She was on the front page of that magazine holding a broom, being perceived and presented as this great change agent sweeping out the old to usher in the new. So busting boundaries is important in very critical adaptive work. Another example of that, in the 1990s in Newfoundland in Canada, the fishing industry along the Newfoundland coast had been supporting that community for 500 years, the fishing of cod. And in 1992, the government placed a moratorium on the fishing of cod. They could no longer fish cod. Why was that? Because most of the fish had gone, they'd disappeared. You had no sustainable industry. There was no point in persisting with the industry, because they had overfished. Because over the last couple of decades, with sonar technology and with these big drift nets that are wide and deep, and with foreign competition coming into those waters, you could now probably get, in one catch what it used to take in 1 year or 2 years. And so these magnificent species were just overfished. And the people got very angry, and they marched on the city hall and the state offices and almost got in a fight with the Minister of Fisheries, John Crosby, and confronted him, and there's video of it, and demanding, you know, you have to lift this moratorium, this ban, and, you know, what have you done to us and our livelihoods? And his response was classic, you know, you can't blame me, I didn't take your goddamn fishes. And that's his language. And on one hand, you can blame him from the point of view of not providing leadership to address that challenge earlier, to be able to break up practices before they became maladaptive, to help regulate an industry and help modify cultural practices to respond to a changing environment. That's what I mean by the internal work of busting maladaptive practices. Another classic example of that is just recently with General Motors. General Motors had a whole array of maladaptive practices internally that culminated in the collapse of that industry in 2009, and it was bailed out, which many, I think other companies were too, and certainly investment banks with the global financial crisis. But in the automotive industry, they were failing to adapt and respond to global competition. They got bailed out. But they treated the bailout technically and didn't do the internal adaptive work. And then only just 2 years ago, there was another major breakdown that pertained to an ignition switch in the car that culminated in tens of thousands of cars being recalled, and a number of accidents where people died. And the new CEO, Mary Barras, was called before Congress. Why in the world has this happened? And she spoke to the challenge. She said, yeah, I'm learning about this, and what I've learned, in my language, is we've got maladaptive practices. We've got cultural practices that have added to these problems. And she talked about two specific challenges, the GM nod and the GM salute. And the GM nod was when anybody talked about a tough challenge, like faulty ignition switches or some kind of quality-related or managerial challenge, people give the GM nod. It's like, oh, yes, that's a problem, but then not do anything about the problem. And the GM salute was to cross your arms and to point out, to say, well, it's not my problem, it's his problem. So it reveals something in the culture about a failure and unwillingness to take responsibility for these challenges, even though they knew about the faulty ignition switch for 10 years. This is an internal adaptive challenge. The government treated it obviously as a technical challenge. We throw more money at you, but if you persist on doing what you've always done, and you're not providing the leadership to address what's deficient internally and bust those boundaries to get the silos connecting and working together to address the complexity of the challenge, you don't bring resolution to it. The third domain or activity, capacity, it pertains to transcending the boundary. It's like the boundary is a constraint. And yes, you've got to do the internal adaptive work within the boundary, but sometimes the work in transcending boundaries is to leave the boundary. You have to go out into the great unknown in the spirit of discovery to do what's never been done before. For example, when John F. Kennedy declared we'll put a man on the moon in 10 years, that is a challenge that would require boundary transcending work. Boundary transcending work is the promotion of creative problem solving. Moving people into a space of the unknown. I think of it like Lord of the Rings, like hobbits, leaving the safety of the Shire, moving out into this dark forest that has potential resources for discovery and connection. And so nobody kind of wants to go out there, but you have to go out there because you don't have sufficient problem-solving capacity to deal with the complexity of the challenges at home. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges we face today. And in particular, kind of one way to kind of address or explain what I mean by that is harnessing the power of diversity. Diverse cultures, diverse religions, diverse disciplines, diverse professions, diverse groups in terms of age and gender. When you think of it, this is an extraordinary resource that we have at our fingertips to deal with complexity. But by virtue of being fundamentally tribal in nature, we don't know how to harness diversity. it carries with it almost a negative connotation. For the promotion of the book a couple of days ago, I did a radio interview. In a moment I talked about diversity. The interviewer said, "Oh, I don't like that idea. I think the most competent guy should get the job." That's not what I'm talking about. But that's what he gravitated to when he heard that, because diversity is like affirmative action, that you're kind of moving, pieces around on a chessboard to make sure everybody's got their piece. Now that's a huge adaptive challenge, obviously, but I'm talking about, rather than seeing or forcing diversity, harnessing diversity, which is a very problematic challenge, by the way. And social science research says that diverse groups generally do better at solving novel problems than homogeneous groups. But that's generally in controlled experiments over time. For a sustained period, it is darn hard to make diverse groups work. And the potential for conflict is enormous. But in our work on adaptive leadership, we talk about the value of conflict, because it gets diverse groups sharing their values, their perspectives, to generate something bigger and more profound and insightful, and that's greater than what any one piece can do. And really, this is the challenge on how do you exercise leadership to harness that power, to kind of provide the holding environment, the container, that's going to generate the engagement, because things can break down really fast. The moment somebody feels insulted, upset, not listened to, for cultural reasons or whatever it might be, they want to flee, they want to run, they want to get the heck out of there. Or the battle starts. There's a fault line and groups take sides, and then they start going at one another. So it's a problematic challenge, but the potential is extraordinary. And we're seeing this potential being used, exploited, and harnessed for productive aims in many Silicon Valley companies that are less hierarchical and realize that their products have to reflect the diversity of their consumer in that wider world. And so Intel, for example, have hired anthropologists that they have working within, not only to understand the marketplace, but to stimulate the creativity and ways of thinking about these challenges internally, and also to manage the process of diversity. So I look at harnessing the power of diversity as a way of stimulating the imagination, of seeing problems through fresh eyes in a way you never could have done before. And in a way, you have to think like an alchemist to be this change agent. The alchemists were these medieval chemists and scientists. And they were dabbling in the arts, creating these experiments of mixing ingredients that they had no idea what's going to happen, what the consequences might be. And literally, through trial and error made these discoveries, and eventually modern chemistry was born. So you're trying to think about what's the appropriate mix. Who, if I put this person together in that group, if I brought these people, yes, it's going to generate tension, and yes, there'll be conflicts. But as we teach in adaptive leadership, you're able to kind of use those conflicts for more productive purposes, rather than try to always kind of reduce the conflict and act like, which people are inclined to do. Let's all get along, right? We've all got something in common, and you're gravitating too fast to what you have in common, rather than harnessing the differences to generate something bigger than what any one individual group can bring. Now, the last capacity I talk about so far, crossing boundaries, busting boundaries, transcending boundaries. Last one I talk about is building bridges. And this is kind of building a bridge over boundaries or connecting boundaries. So bridge building is appropriate for divided groups by conflict, historically or currently, but it's also critical to reduce the mystery of who groups are for one another. I think of what happened, I think it was 1970 or 72, when Kissinger went to China. And then Nixon went to China. And Nixon had to speak to the American people to explain why this is a good thing. And he actually did an amazing job in providing bridge-building leadership, because he had said for the past 30 years, essentially, we've not wanted to have anything to do with this country. And we've fought these kind of proxy wars, whether it's in Southeast Asia or Korea, against the Chinese. And the communist ideology is essentially something so foreign and different from anything that we think is critical for the progress of the world. And realizing this is during the Cold War. And so he comes to the American people and he actually uses this term, building a bridge. He said, you can't isolate 1 billion people. We have to build this bridge between us and them. And yes, while our ideologies may be dissimilar, there's actually a lot we have in common. And he spoke to what some of those virtues are. And it's a way of helping Americans at the time realize, maybe this isn't so bad after all. Realizing the Vietnam War had generated, one, a lot of opposition, and also a lot of lives were lost. And now Nixon, who had been a key player in that Vietnam War, is building a bridge to China. And so nobody realized the value and the importance of that work, and kind of Nixon has got lost in Watergate and the impeachment of him in '74, which is very sad because he actually did some pretty good work in providing that change agent leadership to build that bridge. Of course, Mandela, post-apartheid, and what he has done is extraordinary. One of the things he did, soon after getting elected president, and you may have seen the film Invictus, this is when Mandela, realizing he's got a pretty hostile white audience out there who aren't particularly supportive of him. That's when he goes out onto the rugby field in the World Rugby Cup, and South Africa, the Springboks are one of the players in the final against New Zealand. He wears the uniform of the captain, this green uniform with the number, I think, 9 on the back, which is the number of the captain, Francois Pienaar. And he goes out in the field before the game begins and hugs everyone, shakes their hands, and turns around, lets everybody see the uniform and the number, and the crowd, which is 99% white, just erupts in applause and shouts, Nelson, Nelson, Nelson. And the captain of the team, Francois Pienaar, who said he grew up considering Mandela a terrorist, and just could not believe this man was out here on the field, but he got caught up in the emotion, had to bite his lip to keep himself from crying, and he said it was a transformational experience, and he later became very good friends with Nelson Mandela and asked him to be the godfather to his children, and he's written about that experience. That's an example of bridge building leadership, which is quite amazing. Now finally, to do this work, what I suggest in being a global change agent, you've got to be global in mindset and practice. You've got to have a curiosity about the world and what's going on in the world. You've got to immerse yourself in diverse experiences. If you've got no curiosity, I'm not talking about an intellectual curiosity. I mean the curiosity to head off to Ferguson, Missouri, and go into that community and hang out for a while and say, what the heck's going on here? What can I learn about your reality? I remember one anthropologist talking about when you immerse yourself in a very different cultural world that seems so strange and weird, if you're there long enough and if you're doing it well, eventually it will occur to you that you're the one that's strange and weird. So in a way, when you do this leadership work, certainly those revelations occur to you that your narrative is incomplete, that it's seriously biased in so many ways. The other aspect of the global mindset is a global morality. Joshua Green, in his book on tribes, as I said before, talks about the moral brain of human beings is really a tribal brain, informed by cultural values and tribal values, or a bag of virtues that's kind of given to people. He talks about the importance of a new meta-morality that transcends tribe, that transcends gender, that transcends race, that transcends profession and sector, etc., etc. This meta-morality, I don't know what it looks like, but at least it's this openness that allows us to see beyond the tribe, to see the system, that realizing that simply what gives benefit to my group may not give benefit to the larger system in which we operate. And that's a difficult thing to do. That takes a very big person to be able to stand in that space and to see more broadly than what your own kind of tribal mindset and set of practices allows for. Now, are there people doing this kind of work? Are there people who have those mindsets? Well, here at the Kennedy School, we get to interact with all sorts of students and all sorts of guests who come by, and you meet a lot of people. Gosh, they're actually doing it. It's quite extraordinary. In business, in Japan, the CEO of Rakuten is just amazing. That's the equivalent of the Japanese version of Amazon, Hiroshi Mikitani. He's getting his people learning English and becoming more global. He says, oh, we've got to be a global company, not just an international company. But yes, you're seeing all sorts of interesting people. Perhaps one of the most interesting people that's really doing this kind of leadership isn't some heroic figure that's gone to our school or is a prominent person by virtue of their education or accomplishments. But it's a young 13-year-old woman who's now 17 years of age, whose name is Malala. Imagine when she began as an 11-year-old writing a blog for the BBC about what it was like living under the Taliban in the Swat Valley of, this is the tribal areas of Pakistan, and the implications in particular for what it had for education and the education of girls. So what happens 2 years after writing that blog? A Taliban gets on her school bus, and you've heard what he said. Asked, are you Malala? Are you Malala? Who is Malala? And she stands up and says, I am Malala. And the response is a bullet to her head in this attempt to kill her. And Malala, thank goodness, lives. And now she's this extraordinary young woman with a big heart, crossing boundaries, building bridges, busting boundaries on behalf of the education of women all around the world. It's quite amazing to see, but that's an expression of what I mean by change agent leadership, and it's quite humbling to see the spirit in which he goes about her work. So this kind of leadership, the work we are trying to do in dealing with these demanding, difficult challenges, I know I certainly don't have the answers, but I'm just offering a few insights by virtue of my journey in this work and working with Ronnie and with Hugh and interacting with my students and having the opportunity to work in many countries. I certainly don't present the book as a Bible or the 7 habits of highly effective change agents. They're just a few insights that I hope can help people out. But one thing I do know is that real leadership, the importance of this work, for companies, it can make the difference between success and failure, profitability and excellence and mediocrity. It can make the difference between social capital and social divisions in communities. It can make the difference between life and death for many people. And it can certainly make the difference between war and peace. That's how important it is. And so for you guys to come out and participate in the conversation is appreciated. So I'll finish on that note, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thanks very much. Yes.
I'd like to get your thoughts on something. Could you use the great insights you've shared to comment or to speak on the America-Cuba rapprochement that's going on, especially in context of the historical relationship since the late 50s?
Wow, that's a tough one, right? I think the work of building this bridge between America and Cuba is critical. I remember as a graduate student here, it would have been 1985 or 86, I attended the forum. And I heard, I can even remember the name, Armando Valladares speak. He had been imprisoned in that time for 20 years and just been released, and he came to tell his story. I came out of that talk fuming. How could the Cubans do this to this individual? What a repressive regime. And I don't want to take away from the nature of that repression, and that many people have suffered by virtue of a very authoritarian communist regime. But I also know that they do embody and represent many values in that part of the world and in their country in particular. And I also know by virtue of the Bay of Pigs fiasco under John F. Kennedy wasn't handled particularly well and almost led to a nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That wasn't handled particularly well, but at least handled well enough to ensure there wasn't a nuclear war. And people have struggled with it. And I understand the loyalties that, and the anger and the frustration that many Cuban Americans have, and they don't like this idea of building this bridge and connection. But I also sense that the time has come, that the bridge has to be built. And the challenge in building a bridge is to get people on the bridge and to cross the bridge and to connect with other people over there. And you've got to watch out for the fracturing statements. It's a very volatile period right now because there's a lot of people who will either want to blow up the bridge, they may not go to that extreme, but they want to keep their people from not crossing the bridge, and which is difficult. And they'll say all sorts of fracturing comments that could perpetuate the divisions and widen this divide. But I think Obama is handling it pretty well. And at least Americans can go over and buy a good cigar and come back and tell people at least their cigars are pretty good. And so it's a beginning. So I applaud him on doing that work. Yeah.
I'm a first-year MBA student here at Kennedy School. And my question is about culture. How much we should adapt to the global mindset, global culture? And how to balance preserving culture and adapting to the culture.
私は2年間ぐらい日本に住んでいましたよ。そう、日本よくわかります。I lived for a few years in Japan, so, and it's unique, right? And I have the opportunity of going to Japan every year and doing some work there. Okay, let me kind of be bold here. Japan needs a cultural renaissance if it is to make progress in the larger world. It needs to do this adaptive work on so many levels: in industry, in government, and in the civil society, and in the larger culture. And it's got to become more global in nature. It's got this beautiful homogeneous culture. There's so much that's rich, unique, and special, and makes Japan such a delightful place to go to. But we don't live in medieval Japan. Japan is changing. Even these beautiful, remote, quaint rural villages are changing, with young people no longer wanting to stay in those villages, but moving into the cities looking for work. They've got a seniority system in companies. A cultural practice will look after you. You've got a community. Not a bad practice. But you're not getting the innovation and the creativity that's needed to compete on the global stage. Unlike in the 60s and 70s, you did pretty well, and then all of a sudden things stopped, and we saw the rise of Korea, more innovation coming out of Samsung and other Daewoo, all these interesting, amazing companies in Korea. But Japan, very kind of group-oriented, and it's, once again, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and I cherish that. But that has to be not discarded, but kind of modified so it's more inclusive. Japan doesn't deal very well with diverse voices, and they're a little bit afraid of the foreigner. You know, for good reason, right? You know, when I first went over there and I went into a Japanese house, I wore my boots in, and mud went all over the floor. That's what happens. The foreigner kind of leaves their footprints everywhere, and it contradicts, goes against kind of all these other cultural values. And an aging population means you have to bring in immigrant workers. But you don't just want low-status workers to kind of do the menial work. You bring in other people as well to help stimulate the creativity. And the beauty of Japan is a lot of people want to go there and they want to contribute. But the boundaries are such, it's very difficult to cross and to connect. But the government, it's not dysfunctional. I mean, it's a functioning government, but it's beholden to very powerful political interests that aren't thinking about the requirements of the global marketplace, or how Japan could contribute in dealing with the whole array of social problems in Asia. So you don't see a lot of Japanese going out and participating in like their version of the Peace Corps or in social NGOs and things of that nature. And they could. Japan could be doing so much more than it is currently doing. Japan has an opportunity to do this work, to produce this renaissance. I say renaissance, it's exciting. It's tapped into the resources are there to generate more creativity, to respond to the complexity of these challenges. So I'd love to see something like that happen internally, given the education, one of the best education systems in the world, the educational levels and the training of people, and the capability and the resources, and what you could be doing, not only in strengthening and making this country more resilient, but in contributing to the region, because the larger region is a little bit suspicious of Japan by virtue of what happened in World War II. And, but everybody loves Japan. It's paradoxical. And also what you're seeing in Japan right now is what we are seeing in Australia, my country, and what we're seeing in various places around the world. Given the complexity and all that's going on, and the uncertainty in the air from terrorism to potential financial collapses and demographic shifts, people retreating, or at least becoming more nationalistic and asserting a set of values that aren't particularly adaptive. Some of that is what we're seeing in Japan today, a rise in nationalism. And as I say, some of it is good because it's generating a sense of pride and saying, listen, we can stand up against the bully. But to do that, it also kind of harnesses, in my language, some maladaptive aspects that lead to a kind of a sense of cultural arrogance. And that's what you have to modify and be careful about.
Thanks for being here today. I wanted to ask you about the anecdote you told earlier about Michelle Rhee. I think you described her as a bulldozer, not reaching out to local communities, not really,
not really an inclusive approach to reforming a system.
And there are other examples you could argue of folks in the public eye making the same mistake.
Sure.
Some would say that President Obama and the Affordable Care Act, was a very similar thing, and being a bulldozer, getting that through. But I guess to the other side of that, sometimes without being a bulldozer, things don't get done.
Yes. But if you're going to do this bulldozing way of kind of imposing on the system, admittedly, sometimes it may have to happen because the system is so broken, so maladaptive, that you have to launch a full frontal assault to kind of really break up that system and reinvent it. If you're going to do it, in our language, you've got to have a pretty darn good holding environment. You have to still do the cross-boundary work to develop a network of change agents in the system who are going to speak to the challenge. And so, yeah, there may be casualties. Some people might be let go. But these other change agents can be the voice to the community that explains why this is so critical, why they had to go. Because if you're the target, and if you're the one who's on the front page of Time magazine, you're too easy a target. They can neutralize you so fast. And two, you're putting the spotlight on yourself rather than putting the spotlight on the problem. And you want people kind of really wrestling with the problem and keeping that central. So I'm very kind of fascinated by the notion of being a bulldozer, and under what circumstances is it critical? Under what conditions is it critical? And it's usually when the threat is so great, there's so much at stake, and the dysfunctions are just generating, the system is in danger of collapse, or generating a lot of casualties. So you have to do the full frontal assault. But if you're a foreigner, an outsider coming into that system and trying to do it and getting away with it, you won't survive. You'll be perceived as being too ugly in that approach. And that's certainly what happened to Michelle Rhee. She failed to build this network of change agents to orchestrate the work. Coming back to the example of Japan, the Meiji Restoration, pretty amazing period for about 30 years, is because the Emperor of Japan built this network of change agents who were able to speak the need for change at the local level. And that's why there was no major civil war in Japan. There were pockets and outbreaks of civil war, but most people got on board and said, you know what, we're with you, Emperor, we're going to move like that. Full frontal assault, but with these networks of change agents to carry the load.
So thank you for coming. My name is Pierre. I'm from the Ed School, but I'm also a med student. And so I have a thought experiment for you to think about, if you could just provide some of your insight. Let's say you wanted to create a new master's program for students, one on problem solving, and using this local perspective and engaging people from different disciplines. How would you go about doing that?
I'd be moving that school. I wouldn't have it located in just one place. It's a global environment. It's a global playground. So I'd be moving people around and exposing them to the good, the bad, and the ugly of the world, so that they can get a sense of how people are kind of relating to these challenges, how the different groups and factions kind of see it. Through direct experience, I'd be giving them projects where you've got to go out and try to exercise some leadership on this challenge. Now come back in 6 months and then a year, and we'll start kind of looking and seeing what you did and what you learned from those experiences. So it'd be very experiential. There'd be rich with conversations about what's happening in the world. And sometimes I think around here, there's a preoccupation with prominent people, kind of the bigwigs and players, the alphas of the world, who kind of show up and kind of give us their wisdom. That's fun and that's interesting. You can look on the walls around here and see some of them. But I'd be getting all sorts of other characters from other parts and aspects of society to kind of hear their voices and kind of include them in the conversation as well. And I'd also be bringing in very diverse disciplines. The business school and the Kennedy School and the education school, we don't interact a lot. From time to time on some initiatives it happens. But we ought to be having those conversations. In 2008, we saw, witnessed, participated, felt the consequences of the global financial meltdown. I didn't see any big conversations over in the business school or at the Kennedy School or between schools to say, how did we contribute to this mess? And what do we learn from the mess in terms of what we've taught or what these people have done, and how might we need to kind of modify what we've done? I remember there was a savings and loans crisis in the 80s when I was here. That was kind of a big financial crisis. And the best the business school could do at the time, they didn't have it before, was to hire a professor to teach ethics. That was the first ethics course that began. And his name was actually Professor Goodpaster. So we kind of respond to these challenges with a course. Oh, okay, yeah, we see the piece that's missing. Let's get somebody to teach it. But if we want people to work and succeed in diverse environments, we too must operate and work and harness this diversity. And it's happening to some degree out at Stanford. They've got a school called the Design School. And it's not really a design school. It's a design school in name only from the point of view that it brings multiple disciplines together. Professors, students from engineering and the sciences, computer science, archaeology, anthropology, math, education, political science, all these diverse disciplines together, trains them in a methodology and then gets them working on what we would call adaptive challenges to invent ways, new ways of looking at it, framing it and dealing with it, responding to it. And it also puts them out in the field and they have projects, etc. So some of these experiments are going on. We teach the importance of experimentation in terms of leadership work, that nobody's got this figured out. Nobody's got the ideal school system figured out. And so learning from these other experiments in the world as it pertains to kind of what's working and what's succeeded is another important element of that. One thing I did, remember I talked about living in Borneo with these tribal groups. Eventually I ended up working and doing some work for Harvard Institute of International Development, and I worked for the government of Brunei and helping them reform government. And I ended up taking a lot of executives, senior people in government out into the jungle with me to live with the tribal people. For them to be exposed to the tribal people and to figure out the adaptive challenges on how do we survive, what resources do we have in our environment that we can work with, was an extraordinary and powerful learning experience, but it was only for a week. So there's all sorts of novel, interesting, fascinating ways of teaching, helping people to expand their thinking, to become more globally oriented, but I, for one, don't know enough about those. I, too, am curious about those. But some of the ideas that I've got that I've shared, I think, could be wonderful if we could do something like that. Okay, good. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for coming along and being a part of this conversation. Enjoy the food. Okay, great.
Before you get bombarded.
Okay.
Like stand the great man.